Those of you that were here this morning, you know that I announced that tonight we're going to be looking at 9 questions. But then I went ahead and I let you know that these were not going to be really 9 unique questions. But we have 5 questions that have been submitted, and they're all dealing with the same passage of Scripture. And so what we're going to do for about the first half of our lesson this evening, we're going to look at these questions that have come from Matthew chapter 27, verses 50 through 53. And this certainly is a very interesting event that took place when Jesus died. In this passage it says, Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom. And the earth did quake, and the rocks rent, and the graves were opened. And many bodies of the saints which slept arose, and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city, and appeared unto many. Well, the first question that has been submitted dealing with this verse is, who were these people? Who were the ones that were raised, that came forth from the grave? Well, the text indicates that these were saints. These were followers of Jesus who had passed away during the earthly ministry of Christ. And more than likely, these would have been individuals who would have been known to the other saints in Jerusalem. And they would have been known as individuals who were followers of Christ. Now notice it does not say, and this is something that I find interesting, notice it does not say that all the saints came forth from the grave. It says many of them came forth from the grave. And so from this, I look at this as an indication that only those whose appearance would give testimony to those that they came into contact with of the power of God, only those were the ones that came forth from the grave, those who were able to give testimony to the power of God. Now, there are some that look at this and they suggest, well, more than likely, this is talking about martyrs, those who were well known for having laid down their life for their faith. But there is nothing internally in the Scriptures or externally in any type of historical records whatsoever that talks about there being any type of systematic persecution of followers of Christ until after the church came into establishment. After the church came into establishment, we know that Saul of Tarsus was the main one that led that early persecution. And so, more than likely, these were not martyrs simply because martyrdom was not something that was common during the earthly ministry of Christ. This was something that took place following the institution of the church. But secondly, the question was asked, when did they arise? You know, so often, whenever we read this passage, we look at it as if all of this was something that happened instantaneously as soon as Jesus breathed his last. As soon as he said, "It is finished," then there was a great earthquake. The veil of the temple was torn in two. These people came forth from their graves. But if you look at what the text says, notice that it says in verse 52, it says that these risen saints came forth from their graves at the time that Jesus died. But you come then to verse 53, and it elaborates on that a little bit more. For in verse 53, it says that they came forth after his resurrection. So this was not something that took place at the very moment that Jesus died. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. But notice that it says that this is something that took place after Jesus arose from the dead. Well, Paul in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 18 said Jesus is also head of the body, the church, and he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. Then, in Revelation 1 and verse 15, Jesus revealed to John that he is Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth. Well, folks, what this means is that since Jesus, as this says, is the firstborn from the dead, that these individuals could not have come back to life in the way that this text says until after Jesus had come back to life, after his resurrection, because Jesus was to be the firstborn from the dead. And so this had to take place after Jesus was raised. But notice in the text, we see a couple of phrases. Notice it says that they were raised to life and they came out of the tombs. Well, these are connected to that statement that says that they arose after Jesus' resurrection. And so when did these individuals arise? Well, the text tells us. They arose after Jesus arose. Well, then thirdly, what is the meaning of all this? What was the purpose of these individuals, these saints, coming forth from the tomb? Well, when I look at this, I see a twofold meaning. I see one that would have had more application to those in the first century, and I see another that has more application to us today. First, to those in the time of Christ, this was a sign of the power of God. Because, notice, it was only those who had been faithful to Christ that rose from the dead. It wasn't just anybody and everybody that had died during that time, but it was saints, followers of Christ. And so to those living in the first century, this would have been a great display of God's power, especially if these were individuals that were well known in the community, people that everyone knew. Well, these people passed away. I went to their funeral. I saw them laid in the tomb. I know they were dead, and here they are walking around again. That would have been a great display of the power of God. But then we think about it from the standpoint of us today. We see that this was a great foreshadowing of the second coming of Christ. Remember, Jesus said in John 5, verses 28 and 29, he says, "Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming in the which," notice what he says here, "in the which all that are in the grave." So notice we see a difference here. When Jesus arose, it was some of the saints that arose. But this was foreshadowing what was going to happen when Jesus came again. When Jesus came forth from the tomb, some of his saints arose with him. But when Jesus comes again, everyone, all who are in the grave, are going to come forth. There shall hear his voice. They shall come forth, they that have done good, unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil, unto the resurrection of damnation. And you remember Paul confirms this fact when he was writing to the church at Thessalonica. He said, "The Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first." Well, when Jesus arose from the dead in Christ, those who were his followers, some of them arose with him. So we see some foreshadowing, some looking forward to some events that were going to take place in the future. But with this in mind, we come to another question. And this is one that I had to spend quite a bit of time thinking about and studying on. And that was, were they raised in their natural physical bodies, or were they raised in resurrected, glorified bodies? Well, the Scriptures only tell us that their dead bodies were raised to life, without giving any further details about the aspects of their condition. Now, if they were raised from the dead in their natural bodies, and looking at this from the standpoint of the type of language that is used in these verses, when it talks about them being raised to life, we see the exact same terminology that we see in other passages, such as with the raising of Lazarus in John 11:43 and 44, with the daughter of Jairus in Luke 8:52 and 56, and also the widow, or the son of the widow of Nain in Luke 7:13 through 15. But something that was unique about these three instances, none of those individuals had been deceased all that long. Lazarus had been deceased for 3 days. These other two had not been deceased for even a day, from what I can understand. And so in this case, and as I said, it's the exact same terminology that we see being used here in Matthew chapter 27. It's talking about more of a resuscitation than a resurrection. Meaning that life was restored to their physical bodies. It was not some type of a glorified form that they took on, but they were back in the flesh, back in their own physical bodies. Well, I can imagine these individuals who had been in the tomb, and more than likely, if this is indeed what was taking place, these were individuals who had not been deceased all that long. People that had not been in the grave or in the tomb all that long. And they come back into the city. And I can imagine they began to speak to people about Jesus conquering death, and about how they had been brought back or resuscitated back to life by this miracle that had taken place. But something that we need to keep in mind. Folks, if they had been raised from the dead in some type of a glorified form, then they never would have died again. If they had been raised in some type of a perfect spiritual form, then they never would have died. Now, there are some who take the view that when these saints came forth from the tomb, that they only remained on earth as long as Jesus remained on earth. And that when Jesus ascended to heaven, they were already in their glorified form, and so Jesus went ahead and took them to heaven with him. No, the text does not indicate that whatsoever. These were individuals who had their physical life given back to them. The breath of life was breathed back into their lungs. But they would reach the day that they would die again. One day they would be laid back in the tomb. Now, there are some who look at this and they say, well, when Jesus ascended back into heaven, they went back into the tomb and died again, because the purpose of their resurrection had ended. Well, I don't believe that. I don't think the text indicates that. But we do know that since they were back in the flesh, that the day did come when they would die once again. But keeping these things in mind, these individuals, and one question that was asked, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, this was one that I could not find an answer to that I thought had really any credibility whatsoever, and that was, well, how long did they stay alive? The text doesn't tell us. But what I do know is this: they were alive long enough to give a testimony to the power of God. Because they went into the city, they were seen by those who were there. People knew that these were individuals who had died, that had been laid in the tomb, and now they had been brought back to life. So whether they lived for a few hours, for a few days, or for a few years, we don't know. But we do know that they lived long enough to fulfill the purpose of their resurrection. Okay, our second question for the night is this: did Solomon lose his wisdom when he married foreign wives? Well, my initial knee-jerk reaction is yes. But the actual answer is no. No, he didn't. Notice 1 Kings 11. We're going to look at a pretty lengthy reading here, but I think it's going to give some good clarity on what we're seeing. In 1 Kings chapter 11, let's look at the first 8 verses. It said, "But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Zidonians, and the Hittites, of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, You shall not go into them, neither shall they come in unto you. For surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods. And his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the abomination of Moab in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. And likewise did he for all his strange wives, which burnt incense and sacrificed unto their gods." Now, something to keep in mind. Wisdom. Wisdom is knowledge plus experience. You know, it's one thing to have a knowledge of something, but it's another thing altogether to have wisdom from utilizing that knowledge in everyday situations. Well, the way that we gain wisdom today is by applying our knowledge of the Word of God to real life situations that we face in this life. But is it possible for us to know what God would have us to do and choose to go another way? Absolutely. Absolutely. Just because we've lived the Christian life for long enough that we have amassed some wisdom in certain areas, that does not mean that we are incapable of making a wrong decision. It does not mean that we become infallible and cannot make a mistake. And it's likely that Solomon had married all of these women, at least initially, for political reasons. In those days, it was a common practice for a king, whenever they would conquer another kingdom, that the king of that conquered kingdom would give up one of his daughters to be the wife of the king that had conquered them. And so more than likely, as Solomon was going to battle with all of these different peoples and bringing them under his control, more than likely, many of these relationships, at least initially, started out more political alliances, rather than actually based on love. But notice that the text says that as time went by, he truly began to love these women. He wanted to please these women. And so he began to do the things that they wanted him to do. Well, first off, he sinned by accepting these political alliances. This was not something that the children of Israel were allowed to do. They were to hold themselves aloof from all of these heathen nations around them. But yet, he began to go in and try to make peace with some of these nations and be allies with some of these nations, to become tolerant of these other nations around him. And as such, we see that he pushed aside, at least for a time, what he knew to be right. He pushed aside the knowledge that he had, that God had given to him in such a wonderful quantity. But notice the text says that these wives, 1,000 women. And that's why I said my knee-jerk reaction when I first read this question was yes. But no. But one of the things that to me is so impressive about the life of Solomon, and we don't see this from looking at the accounts that we find in the books of the Kings, But if we read his writings, especially the book of Ecclesiastes, we find that as he got older, he realized he had laid that wisdom aside. He realized that he had gone out and he had tried to find pleasure in life in all of these different ways. He realized that he had turned away from God. And as he came near to the end of his life, you remember the famous verse, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. And so eventually he came to the point of realizing that he had laid that wisdom aside. So although there was a time in the life of Solomon that he allowed himself to get caught up in worldliness, he allowed himself to indulge in the lusts of the flesh, he allowed himself to be pulled astray, as the text says, by these strange or these foreign women, those who had different backgrounds and different ideologies and different religious beliefs. He was pulled away because he wanted to please them. And he did this, he believed, out of love. Okay, our third question for tonight. Was Solomon caught in the tree by his head or by his hair? I can remember as a child and hearing all of the stories about Absalom. Did I say? I think I said Solomon. Absalom. I had Solomon on the brain. Absalom. Was Absalom caught by his head or by his hair? Well, as I was saying, I can remember being young, and oftentimes the Bible class literature and things of that nature that would come out, they would have pictures portraying this story. And oftentimes it would have images of his long flowing hair caught up in the limbs of the tree. Well, let's look at the text. Remember, Absalom was one of the sons of David. He had instigated a revolt against his father, and he was trying to force David from the throne and take over. Well, this led to a battle that we read about in 2 Samuel chapter 18. And this battle took place in a heavily wooded mountainous area known as the Forest of Ephraim. Well, Absalom was riding along, the text says riding along on his mule, and he came into contact with some of David's men. Well, when this happened, he turned and he began to flee. Well, the image that we have here is more than likely he was traveling quite rapidly, trying to get away from the men of David. And the text says that he was caught in the branches of a great oak tree, was suspended in the air, and we know that he was eventually killed while hanging there by Joab. Now, one of the oddities associated with this story is, despite the clear wording that we see in the text that says that his head became entangled, the popular conception that so many have is that it was not his head, but that it was his hair. His hair was what got caught up in the tree. Well, let's look at the text. 2 Samuel 18 and verse 9. It says, Now Absalom happened to meet the servants of David, for Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thicket branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak. So he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him kept going. The Hebrew word for head is not the same word that would have been used for hair. Unfortunately, this clear wording that we see in this verse, the Hebrew word for head, is what is here. But so often we see that it has been obscured by a few of the more modern English translations because they have actually inserted the word hair. You look at some, like, for instance, NIV, New Living Translation. There were 2 or 3 others that I looked at. And they've actually inserted the word hair in this place. Well, the actual Hebrew term that is found in this verse is not the word hair. It's the word head. So where did this misunderstanding come from? What was the origin of this? Well, it probably stems from something that we find a few chapters earlier where it talks about Absalom's appearance. And it talks about the fact that he had a very thick head of hair. This was something that he was very well known for. And the text says that he would only cut his hair once a year. Now, folks, I know how fast my hair grows. If I let my hair grow for a year, it's going to be pretty long. But that was his tradition. That was what his common practice was. And so his hair became, so to speak, his trademark. That was what he was known for. The narrator of the book of Samuel states in 2 Samuel 14 and verse 26, it said that at the end of that year, the mass of his hair weighed about 200 shekels. Now, I didn't take the time, I wish I had, to look up an exact weight. But there's a scale that I found in one of the sources that said that this would have been anywhere from 5 to 8 pounds. That's a lot of hair. A lot of hair. But whenever we look at what we see in the text, we see that there are some additional indicators that are inserted in the text that help us to understand that Absalom would not have been caught by his hair. It would have been his head if he had been caught by his hair. You know, you would expect, because we know that he hung there for quite some time. Because when the soldiers saw him hanging there, they left him. They went back and they found Joab and they told him about seeing Absalom hanging from the tree. Well, here you had a man that was known for being a very vibrant, very vigorous, very strong young man. But he was also, in this instance, a man of war. He would have had great strength. He would more than likely have had weapons with him, things he could have used to cut his hair loose from the tree, or even for that matter, he could have even pulled his hair loose from his head in order to be released from that tree. But whenever we look at the text, notice that there's no reference whatsoever to him putting up any kind of struggle. Notice it never says that he tried to free himself. Notice it never says that he was crying out for help. And so there's some indications that might indicate that he was severely injured. I mean, you think if you were riding on an animal, riding on a mule at a fast rate of speed, and all of a sudden your head comes into contact with a tree hard enough that you get stuck in that tree. Well, here was a young man who could have been severely injured. He could have been incapacitated. He could have been paralyzed. We don't know. But what we do know is the text says that there was no struggle put up whatsoever, no attempt to try to free himself. So where did this tradition originate? This idea that so many people today, including many Bible translators, that he got caught by his hair rather than by his head. Well, the very first reference that we see comes from the secular historian Josephus. And you know, a lot of times we reference Josephus in talking about biblical history because he was a man that lived contemporary to many of these Bible figures that we read about. And so he was able to give a first-hand account to some of the things that were taking place. Well, Josephus wrote a book entitled The Antiquities of the Jews. And in that book, it is very well known that he would exaggerate details. It has been proven that he would intentionally add things to make the story a little bit spicier, more entertaining to read. And more than likely, that is the reason why he is the very first person that we see ever putting into writing that it was Absalom's hair and not his head that got caught in that tree. But what seals the matter for me is whenever we look at the inspired text. And the original Hebrew says that it was his head, not his hair. So we see that this is the case. Now, our next question: does God require a wife to stay with an abusive husband? You know, this is a question that I would just about rather someone else get up here and answer. But let me put it this way. There is absolutely nothing whatsoever in the Bible that requires a Christian wife to live with an abusive spouse. But on the other hand, there is nothing that specifically allows her to leave that spouse. So I'm going to give you my opinion. And as we've seen so many times on these question and answer nights, I know sometimes we have differences of opinion. That's okay. But I want you to know, this is my opinion on this matter. I believe that this would fall under a principle that we see multiple times in the Bible, that sometimes actions that are taken to save one's life sometimes take precedence over other matters. And one instance that we see of this, you remember in Matthew 12, verses 3 through 4, when Jesus is talking to the Jews and he references an instance from the life of David. He said, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? And they that were with him, how he entered into the house of God, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests." Do you remember why he did that? He did that because they were hungry. Because there was a need there. And in order to provide that sustenance that they needed, then he went in and he partook of this bread, that under the law of Moses it was not lawful for him or his men to take. Now, sometimes it might be necessary for a woman, or for a man for that matter. Sometimes there's abusive wives. But sometimes it may be necessary for a spouse to separate from their abusive spouse, or even get the civil authorities involved in order to protect their life and especially the life of their children. But, and I know that this is really the point that the person that submitted this question was wanting to get to. And so this is I'm just going to sum it up this way. Because of what the Scriptures tell us about divorce, I would recommend that she not divorce that abusive spouse unless he has committed adultery. Nothing says that they have to live together and stay in that situation so long as that abuse is taking place. But there's nothing in the Bible that would indicate that that person who was being abused would have a scriptural right to a divorce. And then lastly, and I saved this one for last because we're going to end on somewhat of a comical note. Recently on Facebook, and most of the time on these question and answer nights, I only answer questions that you've submitted. But this was one that I found kind of intriguing, and so it was one that I wanted to share. Recently on Facebook, I read where a history teacher was speaking to his students, and he made the statement that the origin of the term Adam's apple was from Adam choking on the apple that he ate in the Garden of Eden. Well, apparently this phrase is one that many years ago was quite common. It originated back during the Middle Ages, and really there's no scriptural basis for it. But even if it were true, which it clearly is not, why would Adam's apple be more prominent? You know, you think about it, Eve was the one that succumbed to the temptation first. But thinking about this, why wouldn't it be the woman that would have this indication there that this sin had taken place? And this idea was that the man has an Adam's apple as a constant reminder of that initial sin that took place. Well, why wouldn't it be the woman? Because she was the one that, according to the text, sinned first. So maybe we should start calling it the Eve's apple instead of the Adam's apple. Well, in fact, there's no evidence to prove that it was even an apple at all. In fact, the Jews have a long-standing tradition that it was a certain variety of fig that has now gone into extinction. And they say that the reason that they believe that is because they say, well, the text says that they sewed aprons for themselves out of fig leaves. So they probably used leaves from the same tree that they had eaten from. You see, there's no logic behind so many of these ideas that are out there. But on the other hand, and one that I think really probably has more logic and more credibility than any, there's an idea that it probably was not even a fruit that we still know about today. There's no indication that God ever changed His command to not eat of that tree. And so is there still a tree somewhere out there that has fruit on it that we're forbidden to eat from? Well, the Bible never says that God changed that command. Well, the fruit of that tree is probably no longer available to us. And so, just looking at this statement, we can say that this is not the case. That this is just a tradition. It's an old fable that has been handed down for generations, but there's no validity to it at all. Well, that brings us to the end of our lesson for tonight. And it may be that there is someone here that you examine yourself and you realize that there's spiritual needs in your life that we can assist you with. If you realize that you are a child of God, but that you've strayed from the faith, then we would encourage you tonight to come forward. Repent of those sins. Let us go to the Father in prayer on your behalf and be restored to the faith. Or if you've never obeyed the gospel, then we encourage you tonight to do so through faith in Jesus, repentance from your sins, confession of that faith in Christ, and being baptized for the remission of your sins. Tonight, if you examine yourself and you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to come at this time while we stand and sing.